In my opinion, OLED consistently delivers the most accurate picture quality for a consumer television. But some of you prefer to own mini LED TVs which not only don't suffer from permanent burn-in or unwanted auto-dimming caused by static elements on screen, but also can be significantly more affordable than OLED at screen sizes larger than 83 inches. And based on comparison against a 4000 nit reference monitor, the Sony BRAVIA 9 reproduced the creative intent more faithfully than every other non-Sony mini LED television I've tested so far. But first, some basic measurements. The Sony BRAVIA 9 uses a VA-type LCD panel whose viewing angle compensation filter resulted in a lower native contrast ratio of 2600:1 as measured on a 4x4 ANSI checkerboard pattern with local dimming disabled. While the implementation of such a filter could reduce off-axis gamma shift, unfortunately it would also cause some rainbow reflections when hit by light. In terms of the number of local dimming zones, we counted 1,512 independently dimmable zones in a 54x28 grid on our 65-inch review sample. HDR peak brightness on our unit measured 3300 nits on a 10% window after calibration to D65 white point and 850 nits full fill, the highest we've measured from a Sony 4K mini LED TV to date. Of course, there exist mini LED TVs from Hisense, Samsung and TCL with either superior native contrast, more local dimming zones or higher peak brightness. But the magic component that puts Sony ahead is the Japanese brand's local dimming algorithm, allowing the BRAVIA 9 to reproduce the creative intent more faithfully than every other mini LED television from rival manufacturers. Now, when measured, the PQ-EOTF tracking on the Sony BRAVIA 9 exhibited a small dip at the low end and a bump at the high end, suggesting that the TV would crush some shadow detail and over-brighten some highlights. But that's not the whole story. You see, Sony engineers have designed its local dimming algorithm and always-on dynamic tone mapping to compensate for this when displaying real-world content to present an accurate picture for the most part, and the result is impressive. During my review period, I've watched many of the usual torture test scenes, by which I mean challenging sequences for TVs, not the whips and chains variety. And the BRAVIA 9 put up a picture that's broadly in line with the HDR10 presentation on the Sony HX3110 mastering monitor in terms of overall APL and colors, be it in super dark scenes graded to under 1 nit, such as this segment from Season 1 Episode 7 of House of the Dragons, dark scenes with some brighter elements, for example this footage from the 4K Blu-ray of Arrival, mid-APL scenes in titles graded to under 200 nits, e.g. Blade Runner 2049, bright scenes graded to 1000 nits. I like to use the opening of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children for its relatively high APL and 1.85 aspect ratio, and scenes with even brighter elements up to 4000 nits, such as in this familiar clip from Pan, where the BRAVIA 9's higher peak brightness helped it retain more specular highlight detail and provide more HDR pop than the Sony A95L QD-OLED, which is no slouch itself. One key advantage of mini LED TV over OLED is full screen brightness, so naturally HDR scenes with a white background would look brighter on the Sony BRAVIA 9, although the narrower viewing angles of its VA-type LCD panel, even with viewing angle compensation filter, caused the outer sides of the screen to appear darker. Also, the eagle-eyed among you may have spotted a cooler tint surrounding the borders of the active screen area. This was actually introduced by Sony's local dimming algorithm on the BRAVIA 9. As you can see when I put up this white square pattern, then disable and enable local dimming even on the least aggressive low setting, let alone the medium or high options which were necessary to attain inkier blacks. While we seldom saw this edge tinting in real-world content which contains more textures, occasionally it would break through on a lightly toned uniform background or in black and white movies. In addition, there were several signs that Sony has tweaked the local dimming behavior on the BRAVIA 9 to suppress blooming, more so than on previous Sony LED LCDs. In this slow scrolling test pattern we altered ourselves to test for motion issues. You can see the top and bottom of the moving bar appearing slightly dimmer, indicating that Sony has decreased the dimming threshold in these areas to better darken the letterbox bars in CinemaScope movies. In this opening scene from the 4K Blu-ray of The Force Awakens, the Sony BRAVIA 9 dimmed down the stars to achieve deeper blacks and reduce blooming, though the stars are now darker than reference. Of course, once there were sufficiently bright elements on screen, the black floor beneath the stars would have to brighten up however faintly, otherwise the blooming around the bright objects would look more obvious. Because of these measures, sometimes at the slight expense of accuracy, the BRAVIA 9 manifested the least amount of blooming of any Sony LED LCD we have reviewed to date. It's still there if you look closely and especially off-axis, but viewed straight on, it's rarely intrusive enough to take us out of the cinematic experience. You have to be realistic though. As good as the local dimming algorithm on the Sony BRAVIA 9 Mini LED TV is, OLED would always deliver more image depth and dimensionality, however slightly, in most HDR scenes containing a mixture of semi-bright and dark elements, thanks to OLED's pixel-level light control. DCI-P3 color gamut coverage came in at 95% in UV terms, whereas Rec 2020 coverage was 80%, with the underlying spectral power distribution showing beautifully distinct red, green, and blue peaks typical of quantum dot technology. While HDR10 Plus isn't supported, the Sony BRAVIA 9 does handle HDR10, HLG, and Dolby Vision formats. However, we were surprised to find that our review sample couldn't achieve true blacks in the most accurate Dolby Vision dark picture preset either from external Dolby Vision sources or internal TV apps, even when the content demanded full screen black. As a result, the top and bottom letterbox bars in Dolby Vision titles would glow that bit more than in HDR10. Furthermore, our BRAVIA 9 review unit seemed to have been factory calibrated to T65 white point in SDR mode instead of a bluer jut white point typically favored by Sony. Consequently, Sony's SDR to Dolby Vision calculations, which usually convert jut white to D65 in Dolby Vision dark picture mode, caused Dolby Vision content to appear overly yellow, requiring correction using a color temperature preset not used by SDR or HDR10. Until these issues are rectified by Sony through a future firmware update, our preference is to watch in HDR10 when possible, since the BRAVIA 9's inherently high brightness capabilities would largely diminish the advantages of Dolby Vision dynamic metadata anyway. Even with motion flow disabled, the Sony BRAVIA 9 performed 4:4 pull-down to present 24 frames per second movies accurately without telescenic judder, and enabling motion flow frame interpolation did not introduce microstutter or frame-skipping artifacts in 50Hz broadcast content aired in PAL countries such as the UK, as long as film mode was not left on its default high setting. Just like on last year's BRAVIA A95L QD-OLED, which was the first Sony TV to use a MediaTek Pantonic 1000 SoC, film mode high was no longer required in conjunction with motion flow custom to avoid telescenic judder when watching from the internal TV apps. With this in mind, we recommend setting film mode to off for most content and to low for interlaced broadcast material to enable film mode deinterlacing. Now, the very high brightness and larger screen size potential of the Sony BRAVIA 9 could make the mild stutter inherent in 24p films more apparent, and if you are sensitive to this, you can try increasing smoothness film to 1 or even 2 to smooth out the 24p stutter without incurring as much soap opera effect or SOE as equivalent settings on TVs from other manufacturers. Upscaling of sub-4K content was very good, and Sony's reality creation technology, when used judiciously for truly ropey standard definition content, delivered a perceptibly sharper picture while maintaining a respectable degree of naturalness. The TV correctly detected and processed 3/2 and 2/2 cadences in film-based interlaced material, as long as film mode was engaged. In terms of native 10-bit gradation, we observed no issues in mid-APL and brighter scenes. However, in rare instances, such as this challenging low light sequence from the 4K Blu-ray of The Green Knight, some posterization was visible, and the A95L QD-OLED did not fare much better either, which is quite surprising given Sony's traditional prowess in this department. Interestingly, switching to game mode would improve the gradation on the Sony BRAVIA 9 even with smooth gradation disabled, hinting at some underlying video processing, possibly the always-on dynamic tone mapping being the culprit. Our 65-inch Sony BRAVIA 9 review unit exhibited minimal banding and mild dirty screen effect on full-field gray slides, which didn't bother us in real-world content, although the edges appeared noticeably tinted and darker owing to a combination of local dimming and the VA-type LCD panel despite viewing angle compensation filter. For gaming, input lag in game mode measured around 18 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, halving to 9 milliseconds at 120 frames per second, a figure which held firm even with local dimming and VRR engaged. Thanks to the onboard MediaTek Pantonic 1000 chipset, 4K 120Hz Dolby Vision gaming from the Xbox Series X is supported, although our guess is that many BRAVIA 9 owners would likely own PlayStation rather than Xbox consoles. Talking of which, the auto HDR tone mapping procedure that takes place upon initial HDMI handshake between the Sony BRAVIA 9 and the PS5 would set max FFTML and max TML on the console to 2000 and 3000 nits respectively, which are overly high values that would blow out bright highlight detail in HDRG compliant games. We tried our old trick of disabling HDR tone mapping, then setting max TML to 3000 nits and max FFTML to 800 nits respectively, which corresponds roughly to the peak and full field brightness on our BRAVIA 9 sample, before setting HDR tone mapping to gradation preferred. But the result still looked a bit washed out with minor clipping of bright highlights, possibly caused by something else going on with the PQ-EOTF tracking, dynamic tone mapping, and local dimming in HDR game mode. After plenty of back and forth comparisons against the Sony BVM-HX3110 mastering monitor, we finally settled on max TML and max FFTML values of 1500 nits. That's 18 clicks from bottom on the first two adjust HDR screens on the PS5 by the way, which we felt gave us the optimal balance of HDR brightness and image depth in conjunction with the most useful HDR tone mapping setting of gradation preferred. Now, in game mode, the default local dimming setting of medium seemed to be less effective than outside game mode, appearing to use less zones which led to heavier blooming. Unless this is resolved through a software update, assuming it's even fixable and not a deliberate trade-off by Sony to lower input lag, we reluctantly suggest switching local dimming to high in game mode, which should deliver richer blacks and improved blooming control at the expense of maximum peak brightness and EOTF accuracy. VRR including NVIDIA G-Sync worked well to eliminate tearing and frame drops, and native 10-bit gradation in HDR game mode was very good, judging from this gray ramp pattern from the Display HDR app. Only 2 out of 4 HDMI connections are HDMI 2.1 inputs supporting the full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second, of which one is the eARC port. By the standards of TV speakers, the Sony BRAVIA 9 sounded fantastic to my ears, easily one of the best, if not the best I've heard this year. It's certainly a step up from the A95L QD-OLED. While it didn't quite have the refined musicality of the Bowers & Wilkins system found on the lavish Philips 959, it excelled in punch, soundstage, height effects, and bass. Although it's often said that a soundbar will outshine in-TV speakers, I believe you would need a soundbar beyond a mid-range price point to significantly improve on the BRAVIA 9's impressive audio performance with Dolby Atmos soundtracks. It's that good. Let's sum up. The Sony BRAVIA 9 is comfortably the best mini LED TV you can buy in 2024 if you value picture accuracy. Never looking too far off the Sony BVM-HX3110 mastering monitor, which is capable of 4000 nits peak and 1000 nits full screen. The BRAVIA 9 features significantly higher peak brightness and more local dimming zones than last year's Sony X95L, contributing to even greater HDR impact and improved blooming suppression. As someone who enjoys watching movies, I've often found myself unintentionally letting test scenes play on longer than usual while reviewing the BRAVIA 9, emotionally captivated by the TV's dazzling HDR and unexpectedly engrossing sound. Like all TVs we've tested, it's not without its flaws, but if I had to buy a mini LED TV today to rewatch all my favorite 4K Blu-ray discs, the Sony BRAVIA 9 would be top of my list, and so it receives our highly recommended award. In my opinion, designing an accurate mini LED TV is far more challenging than developing an accurate OLED, where each pixel on a 4K OLED TV corresponds directly to a pixel in the 3840x2160 UHD video source. So it's mostly about ensuring the pixel output matches the signal input. In contrast, a mini LED TV, even one with tens of thousands of zones, has to balance numerous factors like local dimming, black level, blooming suppression, color correction, and tone mapping in different parts of the screen, because hundreds, if not thousands, of source signal pixels have to be controlled by one local dimming zone, which in turn must harmonize with neighboring zones. And that's before we even consider stitching these static frames into moving images at 24 frames per second or more. With all this in mind, I want to acknowledge Sony's extraordinary effort in producing the BRAVIA 9 flagship mini LED television, a praiseworthy piece of engineering that broadly upholds picture accuracy to cater for those of you who don't get on with OLED for one reason or another. Now, if you're undecided about whether to buy an OLED or a mini LED TV, one place where you can get good advice is at Richer Sounds, a trusted British AV retailer with more than 50 stores in the UK, who provides 6 years warranty on the vast majority of TVs if you join the company's VIP club. You will get the best deals through cheaper VIP exclusive install-only prices, complimentary gifts or freebies, so go visit your local Richer Sounds store or call telesales for your next TV purchase. Thanks again for your support. Okay, many of you who are considering buying the Sony BRAVIA 9 may be wondering if the Sony A95L QD-OLED would be a better choice for you, in which case you should check out my side-by-side comparison video by clicking here.